Hello, welcome to the final reveals for the mini-set of the Traveling Travel Agency. I'd like to say I've left the best till last, but I've left some interesting cards till last. No, I didn't. The Hearthstone dev team did. Anyway, let's get down to business immediately. Just as a reminder, we have seen one of the Druid cards already. It was one of the brochures, the Ungoro brochure and the Dalaran brochure, both of which I don't think are good enough to see play in current standard, but not intrinsically bad cards. We now get to see the other cards from Druid. First up, Number Cruncher, a 4-mana 2/1 beast. Rush, Taunt, choose thrice, gain +2 attack or gain +2 health. You wait for one choose thrice effect, and then two come along at once. It's London buses, ladies and gentlemen. The effect is really interesting. Just in case you're not wanting to do the mathematics, there are 4 iterations of this card you can get via the choose thrice effect. You either get a rush taunt with 8/1 stat line, 6/3, 4/5, or 2/7. So you can go very offensive or somewhat defensive. It kind of reminds me a little bit of the classic card of Druid of the Claw, where you could either turn it into a 7/6 with Rush, or a 4/9 with Taunt, aka you could push a lot of damage, or you could go pretty defensive with it to protect your face. Now, importantly, this is a 6-mana card versus Number Cruncher, which was a 4-mana card, and Cruncher can actually put out more damage. It can't quite block as much, but it can hit something really hard, and ideally kill it. Now, if you actually run these numbers as other cards existing in the game, compared to Fireball, like the extreme end of the 8/1, Fireball was 4 mana for 6 damage. Now that could go to the face, whereas Number Cruncher can't, but it's still 4 mana to deal 8 damage. Probably a more fair comparison then to this card is actually something like Digging Straight Down. And this is where this card sort of breaks apart a little bit, to be honest with you, because Digging Straight Down sees no play right now in Shaman. That did 8 damage to a minion for 4 mana, and you executed a treasure, so you got a card on top of that as well. I will say the Shaman treasure isn't particularly good at the end of it, but generally speaking, the treasures are somewhat above average in terms of card quality. At least they're above average for their card cost. Okay, let's look at the other end. Let's go to a really defensive version of Number Cruncher. Currently, there is a 4-mana 2/7 taunt existing in the game. It's called Lifeguard. It sees 0 play. Now, the Battlecry effect of Lifeguard is awful, but I don't think it makes a huge difference. If Lifeguard had Rush as well, it still wouldn't see play. So I actually think the 2/7 side of it is weaker than the 8/1 side of it. And actually, funnily enough, way back when, Hippogriff had Rush and Taunt, and was a 4-mana 2/6 instead, so you lost 1 health on it. And that didn't really see any play, so I don't think giving Hippogriff 1 more health would cause that to see play. Now, where maybe this does actually work out, though, is that it isn't just the 8/1, it isn't just the 2/7, it's actually just a very versatile card. Like, you don't always need 8 damage, right? Sometimes you just want to hit, something with 5 health. Maybe it's a 2/5, for example. You go into a 6/3 form, and you get a minion still at the end of it, which still has Taunt. That's somewhat defensive, right? Against some decks, against some minions, some board states, 1 health taunt minion is really frustrating, so there is some potential for this Number Cruncher, the fact that it's so versatile that it can deal with many different situations, that it actually sees some play. The downside of all of this, though, is you could just play a 0-mana 3/4 dragon, and I think this is going to be the moral of the story of the Dragon mini-set. Druid mini-set. Might as well be the Dragon... well, not the Dragon mini-set, but the Druid mini-set is ruined by dragons. I just think the Dragon package is simply too strong to make any of these cards see play, so maybe this is something for the future. Maybe they're going to push a Beast Druid package. Who knows? Also worth noting, obviously you could tourist into Druid as Warrior, and Warrior does have a Taunt deck in it. So maybe your idea is to run this Number Cruncher with stuff like the Detonation Juggernaut and those other minions that have Taunt, and buff Taunt minions in your hand and in your deck. The problem with all of this is, and giving just the extra stats, because this actually works, it doesn't transform it, it gains those stats, so hand buffing is actually a fine thing to do. But at the end of the day, I think from this Taunt package, you normally want to have like Hydration Station as a finisher. And obviously this card is really bad to Hydration Station, because you'll just get a 2/1 Taunt out of it, with Rush, sorry, as well, but there are much better things to Hydration Station, you just simply won't want that in your pool. When I alluded to the big beast, or at least the beast Druid synergy, we also have a spell called Handle with Bear, a nature spell for 2 mana. Get 2 3/3 bears with Taunt. Each time they're in your hand, they gain +1/+1. And as I said, they are beasts, these careful bears, with the effect that I just described. 3 mana 3/3s. It's Shade of Naxxramas, ladies and gentlemen. It has returned in bear form, and it has its luggage with it. It's actually a very similar comparison to the card, funnily enough, because Shade of Naxxramas went onto the field, it had stealth, and then you had the decision to make. Do you want to take it out to stealth and attack with it? Or do you want to leave it in stealth and just slowly accumulate value? Now, the disadvantage of Shade of Naxxramas was, firstly, the value took too long to come up online. A 3-mana 2/2 is an understated minion, right? Also, it was always susceptible to getting hit by AoE or any other effect that maybe can hit a stealth minion, like a random source of damage. Careful Bear has the advantage where it goes into the hand instead and gains the stats instead. And it's much harder to target someone's hand versus something on the field. So you could generate these 2 Careful Bears and just leave them in your hand for multiple turns to get value. You can also do some fun things with the bears in your hand as well. There's not a lot of stuff that you can interact with your hand with as well. But Druid does have access to Frey, the Keeper of Nature, and you could copy your hand with these Careful Bears that have been, like accumulating value over time, and have more bears with more value. Value. The problem with this card is kind of similar to the Shade, though. It's just such a slow value accumulating card. It does start life as a 3-mana 3/3 rather than a 2/2, and it has Taunt as well. All in all, though, a 3-mana 3/3 Taunt wouldn't see play in Standard. And actually, I'd probably go as far to say now that a 3-mana 4/4 with Taunt wouldn't see play in Standard either. I think they're both too weak. So you're not really getting a lot of value off this card until you get to a 5/5. That doesn't also, account for the point where you have to play the card Handle with Bear. You're going to be doing 2-mana do nothing for some time. It's 2-mana draw 2 cards that currently aren't as good as a card that would probably be existing in your deck normally. And it's going to take you some time to get that value. And any time you have to wait for value that accumulates over time, it normally makes the card considerably weaker. So your opponent has more and more ways to deal with your accumulating value. You really need to, ramp that up very quickly. And I think the best comparison actually for this card is, would you rather run Handle with Bear in your deck or Gorgonzomu? Gorgonzomu is a very similar thing where it generates a cheese that accumulates value over time. However, unlike Handle with Bear, Gorgonzomu comes out as a minion. It comes out as a 3/3/3, which you have to deal with. Even though it's understated, your opponent still has to do something about that. Handle with Bear doesn't have that. You don't have the immediate stat line. And actually, when you really think about the value you get from the cheese versus the value you get from the bear, if you want to play both your bears, you're going to have to spend 6 mana. The cheese is always going to be a 2-mana card, and eventually, if you wait long enough, the cheese will give you 3 6-drops, for example, which might, match up with the stat line that you'd be getting from the Careful Bears if you waited just as long for it, regardless, so. And also worth noting that Gorgonzomu doesn't see play in every single deck. I thought this card was really insane, and it turns out it's one of those cards that slots in somewhere around the 25th to 30th card slot in decks that expect to be a little bit slower and more value orientated. So Druid is one of those decks that can do this type of thing, but I just don't see you playing this card versus playing the Dragon package instead. Again, other things worth noting that the bears are Taunt minions, therefore if you're a warrior and you want to tourist into Druid, you can hit it with the Taunt effects that, affect your hand and affect your hand and deck, and buff them up a little bit earlier that way. But again, you don't really want to hit this with a Hydration Station, so maybe run it as a more tempo-oriented deck without the Hydration Station, but I just simply don't see it. I think it's just too slow. It won't work in current Standard, I think. Also worth mentioning, these cards could also tourist into Mage, but I just don't see a reason why Mage would run these cards either versus the Mage cards they already have. Then we go into Paladin land. We have the Busy Bot Mech. 2-mana 3/2 Battlecry. Give your 1 attack minions +1/+1. This is a kind of interesting card for one reason and one reason alone. There's actually only 4 minions in Paladin which have 1 attack. Righteous Protector is one of them. X21 Repair Bot is another one. Amatus is the third one, and the final one is Lawful Longarm, but obviously Lawful Longarm will probably buff itself with, assuming you have cards in your hand, which case it won't be a 1-attacker minion, and won't get hit by Busy Bot. So let's be real, it's 3 minions in Paladin. Obviously there is stuff in neutral land, which we'll deal with in a moment, but there's really not this 1-attack package right now for Paladin, no? Maybe. Well, obviously one of the things that can help this card move along is actually just a good old Paladin button. One of the greatest buttons to press. You push your button, you get a 1/1 dude. What is not to love? Obviously a 1/1 dude can get hit by a Busy Bot, so if you play this on 4 mana, you would get with the button and the Busy Bot, at the very least you get 4 mana 5/4, which is about the average stat line you'd expect, which means it's not good enough for standard, but it's not the worst case scenario. That being said, there are plenty of spells that generate you Silverhand recruits. Also, a minion. Jukebox Totem generates you a 1/1 Silverhand recruit. Muster for Battle is a spell that generates 3 1/1s. Mining Casualty generates you 2 1/1s that generate 1/1s as well. Stand Against Darkness, 5 1/1s. And then we have the neutral cards like Bucket of Soldiers and Replicating Menace that also generate you 1/1s from their effect. So, even though there's very few minions just outright that have 1 attack, there's actually quite a lot of ways to generate the cards. And I think, and I'm going to say this about the whole mini set, I think some of these cards are nods to future archetypes. Like, I think this Busybot is potentially a foretelling that Paladin is going to get some sort of 1 attack synergy. And my guess is going to be a Silverhand type deck, because Silverhands have 1 attack. Yeah. Now, you might be saying, and maybe you're like guessing from my mannerisms, that I think this is a bad card. I think this is a good card. I think this card might actually see you play on like most of the cards in the mini set. And mainly for one reason alone. Oh, scrap that for a second, we'll get to it in a moment. Just also worth mentioning, because you can tourist into Rogueland. Rogue in Perils in Paradise has no 1 attack minions, so there's no reason to tourist into Rogue to try and generate more minions for the Busybot. Mage does have some 1 attack minions, but I don't see any reason why you'd Busybot them there. They're just nothing to do with like their stats, really. Oh no, I did put it in the right place. I'll get back to all of this. There is some other thing that ties this package together, and it's to do with a card that I think will make this card see play, which is this card, Vacation Planning. 4 mana, restore 4 health, summon 3 Silverhand recruits, draw 2 cards. Okay. You might already be able to tell where, like, I think this package all gets pulled together. It does say summon 3 Silverhand recruits on it, which is kind of like the bit that works nicely with the previous Busybot. In terms of evaluating this card, a lot of people, when I saw this on Twitter, were like going kind of crazy over it, saying like, this is an insane card. I think it's a good card. I don't think it's giga insane. I think it will see play though, funnily enough. To evaluate this card, you kind of have to say that how much value is summoning 3 Silverhand recruits? Well, Lost in the Jungle back in Ungoro was a 1 mana summon 2. So let's just say it's 1.5 mana to get 3 Silverhands instead. Flash of Light was restore 4 health and drew you a card, not 2 cards. If you combo that together, that's 3.5 stats. So then you evaluate what is the final draw 1 card. Let's say it's a 1 mana effect. You're sort of getting to like a 4.5 mana type card. Now, anytime you bundle these effects together, they get better. So I actually think that you're getting more than like a mana discount on this card. So overall, the package is pretty good. I will say though, you're probably unlikely to get a lot of value from the gain 4 health, especially if your intention is to use this with a 1 attack deck. Because most minions with 1 attack don't have much health, especially Silverhand recruits. They have 1 health, so you can't heal them. In which case, you're looking at healing your face. But if you don't get the healing, really this card is just Wide Astral Serpent. You're getting a 4 mana 3/3 worth of stats that draws you 2 cards, but the board is wide. It's not a tall 3/3, it's a wide 3 1/1s. Obviously, Astral Serpent can draw more cards later on, but realistically, Astral Serpent normally gets removed from the board the turn after it is played. And you have a disadvantage of Astral Serpent of not being able to attack with it if you want to keep drawing cards. So I think it's a fair comparison between the 2 cards. And Astral Serpent isn't seeing any play right now. Obviously, the intention of this is to combine it with Busybot to give you 6 mana, generate 6... it generates 3 2/2s, which is 6/6 in stats, plus the 3/2 mech, so 9/8 in stat line, for 6 mana, and draws you 2 cards and restores 4 health. That's a good little package together, right? Also pretty nice with stuff like Toy Captain Tarim. You can turn your 1/1s into 3/7s instead. Pretty good value. It does require 9 mana, though. Also good with Flash Sale. You might be able to start to see a pattern, by the way, of some of the spells I've shown before and the spells I'm showing you now, of where I think this might see some play. Flash Sale also likes you to have a big tokeny board full of stuff. What else likes to see big board full of stuff? Flood Paladin. Flood Paladin would probably love a card like this. It's a card that generates you many things on the board, also gives you a little bit of a refill, which I think is one of the weaknesses of the Flood Paladin deck, is its capability to refill its hand. Obviously, this isn't going to replace something like Showdown. It would be in there with Showdown and Sea Giants. And there's actually some reason to run this. Currently, Flood Paladin I think it's somewhere around like tier 2, tier 3 deck right now. It's had a few nerfs over the past few expansions. And by past few, I mean like the last 2 expansions. Muster for Battle is seeing some play in that deck, and I don't think Muster for Battle is significantly better than Vacation Planning. It is 1 mana cheaper, and maybe that makes all the difference, the 1 mana less. But maybe you can fit some other room in to have both your Muster for Battle, your Vacation Planning, and your Showdown in your Flood Paladin to just generate you big boards to discount your Sea Giant. So I actually see a world where this 1 attack deck, Silverhand stuff, sees some play, and it might be some sort of amalgamation of what was current Flood Paladin with what Flood Paladin will be with these Silverhands. The final Paladin card we're going to see is Trust Fall. 4 mana Paladin spell. Discover 2 minions that cost 5 or less. They gain each other's attack and health. This card is super hard to evaluate, to be completely honest with you, and I've really struggled with it. There's not really anything like this from the past of Hearthstone. The closest thing I could find to something like this is like a Dark Prophecy-like effect from Priest, where you discovered a 2-drop and you gave it 3 extra health. There are a few other cards where it's like discover a card that gives them stats on top of it. Demonic Dynamics, for example, for 3 mana discovers 2 demons. Finale, you give them +1/+2, sorry. Take to the Skies, Shooters for dragons in your deck, so it's not discover, and you give them +1/+1. And funnily enough, Ungoro Brooch, which we talked about in the last part, draws 2 minions that gives them +2/+2. I think these 3 cards are quite similar to how Trustfall is. However, Trustfall can give you probably more stats than any one of these cards. I don't know exactly what the best play is going to be for this card. The temptation immediately is just to say, you know, generate 2 5-drops. What is the average stat line for a 5-drop? Well, with the existence of Battle Cries, it's probably somewhere around like a 4/5 right now in the current standard. I should have checked this. If you can get 2 5-drops, which have both +4/+5, you know, you're discovering 2 cards that sure aren't in your deck, but they're probably better than the average card in your deck, and actually fills your curve out pretty nicely. You play your Trustfall because you're playing 4 mana do nothing as well, so you need a big power spike play on the next turn. Then you play your 5-drop with 4/5 stats on top of it. Is that good enough to make up for doing nothing on turn 4? I'm not entirely certain. I think it probably then depends on what the board state is actually what you do. You'll probably want to discover good minions in general, probably more so than the stat line of the minions. Typically, battle cries are better than the stats, right? I'd probably say it's a hand-wavy fair term for the current Hearthstone gameplay. So I think generally you will look for best minions, but best minions with stats on top of it is pretty nice. I think this is going to be a little bit too weak. In general, just generating random stuff is less good than having good stuff already in your deck, but I don't think this is a bad card at all. There's also some merit potentially if you had, you know, like, you played this on 4, on turn 5 you maybe had another 4-drop with it, just to generate a 1-drop and a 5-drop and make the 1-drop super powerful, just again to fill that curve out. Maybe that is where it sees even more power, and you just accept that the 5-drop that you generated doesn't have much of a stat line on top of it. I will say the counter to this card, though, is that if you look at Demonic Dynamics, that sees 0 play right now. The demons you can discover in Demonic Dynamics, I'm losing my mind and my tongue. They can be both more than 5-drops. However, the finale effect on them is only giving you like a 1-mana effect, so it's actually really hard to evaluate this card in total and how good it's going to be. I think it sits somewhere in the middle. Other downsides, though, it's a spell, so Hand of Paladin won't run it because it's not a minion. Now we get to Warlock Land. We've already seen one of the Warlock cards. It was called Employee of the Month. I actually forgot to mention about this card as well, that Rogue tourist into Warlock Land. So, Rogue is one of the classes that famously doesn't have a lot of lifesteal or ability to mitigate damage or like regain health, sorry, to be more specific. I don't think this card is good enough for Rogue either, but it's just to be aware of it. You could tourist into your Rogue to put this in your deck. What else do we see in Warlock Land? We see Fine Print. 4-mana shadow spell. Deal 4 damage to all minions. Excess hits your hero. Okay. It is AoE Unstable Shadow Blast, and that Unstable Shadow Blast saw a lot of play back in the past, mainly in Quest to Warlock to complete the Demon Seed. And truth be told, I see this Fine Print card being more of a menace in Wild than Standard, and I'll talk about that later. Just to allude to that though, we actually have seen deal 4 damage to all minions in Hearthstone recently. It's Chaos Nova, which was a 5-mana fell spell that deals 4 damage to all minions with no downside. Is it worth the 1 mana discount to take excess damage to your hero? I don't know. It could potentially be a lot of damage. Like, if you just imagine, for example, I know this case would never happen. If both the boards were full of 1-drops, 7 1-drops on both sides, and you played Fine Print, you would take 42 damage and explode. So obviously you don't want to explode. I don't know what really the average is going to be on this card, but I could see worlds where you're taking, you know, like 9+ damage off this card, which is a lot of pain to take. Now, obviously, Pain Warlock is a thing, and it has ways to mitigate the pain. One nice thing would be to combine your Fine Print with your Fellstring Harp, which you could also set up 1 turn early. You clear your opponent's board, you would have taken, you know, like 100 damage, whatever it is, but you don't. The Harp instead protects you and actually restores you a little bit of health. Very nice. One downside of this card, though, is that the other thing that you normally mitigate damage with is Void Virtuoso. That won't work with Fine Print, because I believe the order will be that Fine Print kills your Void Virtuoso, it will remove the effect of the Void Virtuoso, and then you'll take the damage from the spell. I think that is the ordering of this, in which case, you know, you're taking at least 1 damage, plus whatever the excess is of the other cards. So there's actually not that many ways to mitigate it, and you could get yourself in a really tricky situation. Worth noting, though, that sometimes maybe it's worth getting yourself into a tricky situation. If you do take like 10 or 12 damage or something like this on Fine Print, your Fearless Flame Juggler, if you can play it on the same turn, is going to be disgusting. Like, playing 2 mana 13/13s, yes please. Also, if you're again taking like 9 damage at once, you might be able to just discount Imprisoned Horrors straight to 0 from, you know, nowhere, basically. And that is going to be a fairly disgusting thing to do. You might even want to try and set it up yourself. You set up your Party Fiend early. Next, you play your Fine Print. Your Party Fiends all die. You take the excess damage of each of them, which is 9 in total. You play your Fearless Flame Juggler, and then you have 10 10s on the board. Now, I will say, if you actually like evaluate this and combine it together, it is a 7 mana combo to summon a 10/10 that does 9 damage to your face. Is that worth it in Standard? I'm actually not convinced it is. I think that is too big a price to pay. And it's just a minion with a big stat line. Sure, some decks won't be able to deal with it, but others can really like tangle it up for some time and deal with it over the course of other turns. So, yeah, I'm not sure about that one. The other thing that makes me think this card is actually going to see no play in Standard is actually, if you look at the Pain Warlock deck, they don't really have AoE damage, and there is a reason for that. They are like the primo supremo tempo deck. The whole point of this deck is you play overstatted minions with a drawback, the drawback being you take damage, which then allows you to do some disgusting cheat down the line. And the balancing act of that is balancing your health, like trying to survive above you being, you know, OTK'd by your opponent from where it is. Funnily enough, actually, off camera I played a game of Hearthstone, and I went against Pain Warlock that put themselves down to 2 health, and won the game and stabilized from there with Infernal and other things. You just have to balance this fine line. And balancing this fine line, I don't think will include the Fine Print. I just think you will always be ahead of your opponent on minions. You just won't need the AoE card. It just simply won't be a necessity in that deck. So I don't see Fine Print making play in Pain Warlock, which then leads you to go, will it go into Insanity Warlock? And I don't think it will. I think Crescendo is just better in that deck. And generally speaking, you generate a board in the Insanity Warlock deck that you don't want to hit by your Fine Print. So the Crescendo being not symmetrical on the effect is actually extremely important for that deck. So I don't know where Fine Print sees play. I don't think it sees play in Standard. I think it's going to be in Wild with some sort of Demon Seed deck. The final Warlock card we've got is Deadline. 2 mana tradable spell, Shadow. Tradable temporary, destroy minion. I'm not going to lie, when I saw this card, I was like, Cal. I did not understand what this card meant, and I think it's somewhat fair for me to not understand what this card meant. I'm pretty certain I'm aware of how it works now. I actually started to Google the keyword temporary in the Wikipedia, because normally, temporary is a keyword you give to a card that means that at the end of the turn you discard the card if you don't use it. And what is the key on this on the notes of this card is that no card by itself is temporary. That has never existed before. Until now, until Deadline. So the way this card works is that it enters, whenever it enters your hand, it becomes a temporary card. So like it becomes that like, you know, shadowy form of the card. And if you don't use it at that turn, the card is discarded. And the way to mitigate that is to trade it. So you spend 1 mana to put it back into your deck, so that in a future turn, you could use it. What a terrible, terrible card. This won't see any play. This is stupid. It's a funny design. Haha, very funny. It's really, really bad, though. And I'm going to tell you why this card is really bad. The quintessential card right now for destroy a guy in the history of Hearthstone is Assassinate. Currently, Assassinate is a 4-mana spell, destroy an enemy minion, where you can target the minion as well. It sees 0 play, which kind of suggests that destroy an enemy minion with like no strings attached might be like at least a 3-mana type effect. But is it? Because also Death Knight has access to Obliterate, and they have a control deck in Death Knight. It's called Blood Death Knight, and they don't run Obliterate in that deck, which kind of implies there's no real draw to play a single target removal spell in Hearthstone right now. Maybe there will be down the line, but currently it just doesn't exist, which kind of makes sense to some degree when you think about the existence of the Unkill axes, which have elusive and you can't target them. So perhaps that is part of the reason. And then the other reason being that a lot of other game states for Hearthstone are wider boards right now than they are tall boards. So I just don't see a reason why you would run this. And again, if we're getting to the point where this is, you know, if we say destroy an enemy minion for 3 mana with actually no strings attached, like you don't take the 3 damage, all of this, if that would see play in Hearthstone, if you trade this back 1 time, you're at that 3 mana mark. With, you know, all the harassment of this card as well, that you can't get it necessarily when you want it. It's in your deck. So it's like the ultimate quick draw, being that it's bad. It's not like quick draw where the effect gets worse, it's just you lose the card. It's literally, I put a card in my hand that I can't use and it goes away unless I spend mana. It's 1 mana, do nothing. Terrible, terrible card. By the way as well, if you're really, really desperate for single target destruction in Warlock, they have Siphon Soul, which is destroy a guy for 4 mana with an upside instead. That also sees 0 play right now in Standard, so I think there is absolutely no way that Deadline sees any play. The only way this card sees any form of play going forwards is if there is some sort of effect with the tradable type of things that you get a benefit to trading the card, or if there is some sort of discard synergy with Warlock, which there really isn't right now, and there is a benefit for you losing the card via the temporary effect. Until that happens, this card is just, don't put it in your deck. It's literally just a terrible card. Now we get to Death Knight land, the final class I think we're going to go through. There are some neutrals at the end though. We have Soul Searching, 2 mana Shadow spell, double Unholy rune requirement. Discover a card from your deck, spend 5 corpses to copy it. Okay, Death Knight has now got Creation Protocol or Bottomless Toy Chest. Debatably, it's easy to get the Soul Searching requirement later, but early it's easy to get Bottomless Toy Chest is how I would compare these cards. And then Creation Protocol just sits somewhere in the middle. You have to spend 2 extra mana to get the effect of that card to give you a multiple copy of a card. I think this card is pretty good. Obviously, like Creation Protocol, Bottomless Toy Chest, there has to be like a very specific target for it. In Creation Protocol, you're trying to hit Amenthal, which gives you a huge amount of value. It's a very good card for removing stuff and generates you random legendary minions. Bottomless Toy Chest normally is used to copy some sort of combo piece in the deck. But if Druid had this big great card, you could Bottomless Toy Chest the big great card, like the Titan, for example. And funnily enough, Death Knight has some big great cards in the class. The Primus, for example, is actually very similar to Amenthal, that it can remove a guy. Amenthal can hit 2, obviously. It gives you health instead of generating you hand value. No, it still does generate some health value. Actually, I'm talking nonsense here. It doesn't remove another card, it gives you health. You do get a card, it is of the rune requirement of blood if you're using that effect, unlike getting a legendary minion. Would you rather a blood rune card or a legendary card? Actually, you might want a blood rune card that you discover versus a random legendary, because random legendaries can be pretty bad, and I'm aware of this after playing some Evolved Shaman recently. The other card that's very nice to hit is obviously Reska. You play your Soul Searching, you hit a Reska in your deck, you copy the Reska. Reska obviously will be a 0 mana card because it always is a 0 mana card, and you have 2 copies of that to steal opponent stuff. Very, very disgusting. One of the downsides of this card is, like I say normally, compared to some of the other decks that do these copy minions in your deck cards. And actually, one thing worth noting, this isn't a minion on soul searching, it is a card, so you can actually hit spells with this as well, which is actually somewhat of a downside to it. You'd probably prefer it to just say minion rather than card. But you'd probably want it into some sort of slower, more value control-orientated deck. The current control deck out there that people normally go to is a Blood Death Knight deck with stuff like Soul Steal, but obviously you can't run Soul Searching and Soul Stealer in the same deck because you can't put 2 Bloods in your double Unholy deck. However, the deck you can put this in where, whoops, sorry, my bad, where I think it will see some play is in the Mining Excavate Death Knight deck. They run double Unholy single Frost Rune, and there are cards in that deck, aka Resker, the Corpse Giant guy, what's it called? The Primus is normally in that deck. There's a bunch of cards in that deck you would like to get copies of. And in fact, there's actually some spells in that deck you'd be pretty happy to get some copies of. That deck is pretty tight though, so I don't know if there's room to like wiggle on this. Maybe there is some room, and if there is some wiggle room, I think it'll go into that deck and would actually slot into that deck pretty nicely. I gave you a sneak peek of this card. The other Death Knight card we're getting is Travel Security. 6 mana 2/2 Undead. Taunt, Death Rattle, summon a random 8-cost minion. Interesting. It's very similar to something like Mechanical Whelp back from the past, which was a 6 mana 2/2 mech that gave you a 7/7 Mechanical Dragon on the Death Rattle. Two different things about this card. Firstly, an 8-cost minion on average, and we'll get to the stats of this, is actually slightly better than a 7/7 on... Well, it's somewhat better than a 7/7 on average, in my opinion. The other big thing about this card, and actually why it's kind of obnoxious, and maybe sees some testing, is it has Taunt, so you can't get around this this guy. You have to deal with it as your opponent. You can't just ignore it and leave it on the field. You have to hit it, otherwise you can't hit your opponent's face with your minions, and that's actually a pretty big thing. It's also fairly similar to a card that exists currently in Standard called Containment Unit, which is a 7 mana 6/6 mech instead that summons a random 8-cost minion. Instead of Taunt, this has Magnetic, which means you could put it onto a mech and rush the mech into something to get the Death Rattle early. So again, you could kind of ignore this card to some degree, unless your opponent rushes it into something with the Magnetic effect. I think this card is pretty interesting. Obviously, the intention of this is to run it with the Death Rattle package, which Death Knight has. They have stuff like Death Growl to spread it onto other minions. Spreading this onto the button seems disgusting. You could Yelling Yodel with this card as well to generate a bunch of 8-drops. You could Mosh Pit this as well to give it Reborn, so you get even more value on the Death Rattles after it dies. Problem being, I don't know if this card is cheap enough to see play, I guess. And by what I mean from this is that if you think about what Breakfast Hunter does right now, where they try and Yelling Yodel their egg, that deck didn't really work because it just took too long to set the egg up into the Yodeler. It just meant that you kind of lost before that window of value happened for you. Similarly with the Death Knight deck, you have to wait till turn 6 to play your Travel Security. You're probably not playing your Yelling Yodel on the same turn as that, so you're going to have to wait another turn for that. And realistically, if this deck was very strong, you would just trade into the Travel Security and accept that they get an 8-cost to stop them Yelling Yodel it or Death Growling it. So, I'm not entirely certain if this goes into the Death Knight Death Rattle deck. There's also probably better options out there for it. Currently there's the Frost version of this deck that uses Frostbite and Freebooter with this Death Rattle package, and this comes up way early in the Travel Security will do, and is doing like 5 damage hits at a time to the opponent's face, so it's pretty aggressive. The other form of this Death Rattle deck is using the Nerubian Egg as more of like an unholy tempo-y deck, and I just don't think you'd put Travel Security into that deck. I think it's just simply too slow to work. Now, the other nice thing about this card, though, is it isn't undead like most of the cards in Death Knight are, which means that it does get hit by undead-like effects like Toy Snatching Guys and Amateur Puppeteer, so you could buff this minion even more, which is pretty obnoxious when it has Taunt to begin with, so your opponent has to deal with it in some way. Or if you discount this and get it onto the board early to give the Death Rattle effects a little bit chance to happen faster, maybe that is a thing, maybe it becomes its own separate deck. Where I think, though, this is realistically going to see some play, or at least some testing, it's actually in the Warlock deck. Warlock can Taurus into Death Knight, and he's actually screaming out for a good Death Rattle in that deck to abuse with some of the Dark Marrow. Currently, the best thing to do is actually hit the Nerubian Egg with it. There is also the Imp, which I've not got in here, it turns out, but there is that Imp as well that you could hit with it, but you kind of want one additional thing as well. Now you do. Now you have travel security. If you can get, let's say you have the coin, for example, because it doesn't quite curve perfectly into this, or you play Dark Marrow on 5. If you can lead Dark Marrow into travel security, for 6 mana you're getting 2 8-cost minions. That's pretty disgusting, no? Especially disgusting when you think about, what 8-drops you could hit. There are 33 8-drops currently in Hearthstone. I said that it's slightly better than the Whelp. On the stat line type of things, it's not actually. It's actually a 6.3, 7.42 average, which sort of means you're on average going to hit a 6-7. However, when I say this is better than the Whelp, there's actually quite a lot of good 8-drops out there. For example, the Primus is an 8-drop. It is a Titan. I think it is the only 8-drop Titan, but you might hit that. There's also some pretty nice stuff like Tyrion Fordring, which would be an insane card to hit. The unfortunate thing is there are some, 8-drops aren't quite made as well as others. There is Deep Miner Brand in the 8-drop pool as well, so maybe you do get really, really unlucky sometimes with the travel security. And the fact that this is going to be just a little bit more inconsistent than, knowing exactly what you're going to get means that this card doesn't quite see some play. But, any minion with a really understated stat line with a big death rattle on it, normally someone tries to abuse it in some way. So I wouldn't be surprised to see if people try to abuse this card. The final Death Knight card is Eternal Layover, 4 mana single unholy rune spell. Give all minions reborn, then destroy all minions. This card, I'm not gonna lie, I think this card is terrible. Death Knight has a card currently that, gives your minions reborn. Not reborn, sorry. Let me talk about the card already. Death Knight has Dead Air, okay? Which destroys all of your undead and resummons them. Assuming you're using Eternal Layover, which by the way has a symmetric effect on the card, but assuming you're trying to use it to, improve your own board state, which is what you would do. You would purposely make your deck in such a way that it abuses the Eternal Layover effect, aka has like death rattles in it to, get the most from reborn. Why would you not use Dead Air? It is just better, no? Because if you think about it, if you give your minions reborn and then destroy them, you're leaving your minions at 1 health. If you use Dead Air and kill your minions, they get to full health, and it's 2 mana cheaper to play the Dead Air. The rune requirement is worse than Dead Air, you have to have a Frost Unholy deck, but the effect on it is pretty good. Now, you might actually point out, and this is somewhat true, it hits the opponent side of the board as well, so it's actually kind of a combination of Dead Air and Equality combined into a card. Worth noting though, if your opponent has Death Rattle effects, you're going to trigger their Death Rattle effects for them, which isn't ideal. Fortunately, there's not that many Death Rattle cards seen play currently in Standard, and actually most of them are in Death Knight, so as long as you're not in a Death Knight mirror, you're probably A-okay. Other weird things about this card to some degree, you might say that Dead Air, the other restriction of Dead Air is it has to be an undead, right? Like travel security, that's an undead. What if you want to hit a Death Rattle minion in Death Knight that isn't an undead? Spoilers, there's only one. It's Obsidian Revenant. That is the only Death Knight card with a Death Rattle that isn't an undead. So, it doesn't really expand your pool considerably. You can hit some neutral minions and like some of the mechs, like the Containment Unit, for example, but I just think this card is kind of hot trash, And in terms of like AoE damage, Death Knight has so many good forms of AoE damage. Why would you want Eternal Layover to be an equality-like effect? I just simply don't think they do want it. Where I think this card maybe, though, does see some play, it's in Warlock again. I think this is quite a nice card for the Death Rattle Warlock deck that goes into Death Knight, where you maybe give Reborn to, like, your Vona, or more realistically, your Ouroboros, right? You give it to your Sacrificial Imp, then the minions die, and you get their effect on your side of the board. So it's kind of like playing Dead Air in Warlock, where Warlock doesn't have the card. I still don't think that is good enough, but maybe, just maybe, it sees some play. Finally, we get to 2 neutral cards. We have Clumsy Steward, 3 mana 2/4. After any card is drawn, make it temporary. I'm not going to lie, low-key, I think this card is kind of good, but I don't think it's going to see play. At least, it's really, really obnoxious. Now, you might be saying, why is it obnoxious? There have been very, very few cards in the history of Hearthstone that cause your opponent to discard a card. It doesn't happen a lot, and times when it does happen, it becomes prevalent. The game tends to get into a very toxic state. I actually went through the annals of Hearthstone. These are about the only cards I could think of that have this kind of like make your opponent discard a card. I know that making a minion or a card, sorry, temporary in your opponent's hand isn't quite the same as that. They have a chance to play it, but it's a very small window to play this card in, and more realistically, I think you're probably going to just discard it with the temporary effect. There was a card called Chaos Gazer, funnily enough, that had a very similar effect, where it was curse a playable card in your opponent's hand. They have one turn to play it. Note, it had to be playable, by the way, so it wasn't just random. That's one of the things. There was then a few of the cards like Felsoul Jailer, which made your opponent discard a card, but you, on a death threat, had to return it, so you had to do something to the Jailer to not return it to them. Rain, which currently exists in Standard, which actually doesn't go, hand negative. It actually just replaces the cards instead. Then we get to the 4 or so cards which all came out in the same season. I think it was the year of the Hydra, but I'm not really good with the memory of the names of the years. Which included stuff like Disruptive Spellbreaker, which made your opponent discard spells, Patchwork, Mutinous, and Ghastly Gravedigger. Now, these 3 cards also play in pretty top-end decks, normally bouncing the battle cries or doubling the battle cries in some way. Especially Mutinous was very, very disgusting. Eating 2 opponent's minions in the hand meant they went -2 on hand, and there's not a lot you can do to counter that, so pretty toxic. And actually, Rogues were running secret packages just so they could run Ghastly Gravedigger into the deck. Choose a card in their hand, bounce it back into the deck, and if you knew what the card was in the hand, like if it was generated by something else, you could put stuff like Astalor back into the deck, for example, to interrupt that chain. Then we have Star Student Starina, which require you to outcast, which then let you shuffle a card into their opponent's deck from their hand. And then finally is Jade Telegram. By the way, if you've not seen this card, this was in Caverns of Time, so this card has never existed in Standard, it's only ever existed in Wild. And this is kind of it. There are a few other ones. I didn't include Immolate in here, which burns cards for 3 turns. That gives you enough time to play around it, but I think these are like it for the entirety of Hearthstone across all classes. These are the ones that make your opponent discard a card in some way. And now we have Clumsy Steward. If you play the Clumsy Steward on your turn, your opponent is unlikely to be able to kill it on your first turn, right? Because that's the way Hearthstone works. They will draw a card, and it will instantly temporary, and your opponent will have the choice. Do I top deck and play this card, or do I let it go away? And I think more often than not, your opponent is going to let it go away. Why do I think this card is actually quite important? Well, a lot of the decks right now that are really good are actually low-key, some sort of combo-y type deck. It's like a hidden combo deck. It's not an OTK, but there are really powerful combo plays existing within the decks. For example, Handbuff Paladin, a very powerful play in that is that they outfit tailor one of their minions on the board. The outfit tailor gets a bunch of buffs. You hit one of the minions that exists on the board, and it's effectively giving that minion that amount of stats as charge. And you can get your outfit tailor quite easily up to 8/8 type thing. So it's like getting an 8/8 charge for 3, which is disgusting. If you steward and they draw their tailor, they have a choice. Do I just play the tailor immediately, or do I lose it? You're probably going to play it, in which case you're playing a 3-mana 2/2. That is really obnoxious to deal with. Similarly, in Overheal Priest, if you hit an Injured Hauler with this, they might have to just drop this straight onto the board, and you really need a bit of setup for the Injured Hauler to get it, prepared, have some form of healing to mitigate the battle cry of the effect. If you don't, this thing is just going to get killed off, and if you kill this thing off, Overheal Priest is not as scary anymore, funnily enough. Similarly, this might not just hit minions, it could hit spells. In Sanity Warlock, they use Crescendo at very, very specific times. What if you make them use it when they don't want to use it? They probably want to use it because they need to take the fatigue damage to buff their other cards. But if you have nothing on the board, for example, other than the Clumsy Steward, and you make your opponent Crescendo for 4 damage, that's a pretty big swing of things. And then finally, the other case scenario of this is not just cards that your opponent can play. You might hit a card that your opponent can't play. You play your Clumsy Steward on 3, it goes to turn 4, you draw, an 8-drop or something. They can't play it. They have to lose that card, realistically. So, there are some ways around this, of course. The best way around it would be to kill the minion and then cycle your hand back into your deck by some means, in which case the temporary would be lost when it goes back into the deck. But it's a really niche interaction for that to happen. There are also some really memey shit you can do with this card. You could potentially Clumsy Steward and intentionally not outcast Paraglide to draw 3 cards, make your opponent draw 3 cards as well. By the way, they're also temporary on your side of things, so the way I imagine this is you'd play a very, very, very aggressive deck with lots of low cards. In which case, you don't super care that you lose the cards, because you're probably losing worse cards than your opponent at the very least, or you could play them in turn with this card as well. Other things that I thought maybe you would see some play with this is Warlock classically has had a discard package in it. It does have Rin currently, and you could potentially play Steward into Rin. Rin would cause your opponent to draw 2 cards. They would be temporary. They would then discard 2 cards from the Rin effect, which might actually hit the temporary cards if you're unlucky. And then you lose 2 cards as well. And realistically, they might lose those temporary cards later on. So it makes them potentially cycle a lot of the cards out of their hand and lose them. It's like a really great combo breaker of a card. If any big OTK combo deck existed, this is your tech card versus that deck. The problem with this, though, is if you're going to do this, you really want some effects that reward you for discarding cards, because you're going to get some temporary cards on your side of the things that you don't want to play. Warlock has always had these type of things, like when this effect goes off when it's discarded. Unfortunately, currently Warlock only has 1 card, and it's Furnace Fuel. It's the only card that goes off currently when a card is discarded, or when it is discarded. So this might maybe gives a hint for the future. Maybe Warlock is going to get a discard package again. I don't know, we might be reading too much into this on a neutral card. Either way, I think this card is potentially as a tech card. Pretty toxic, by the way, especially if you can't deal with it and they play it on curve. So yeah, I can see worlds where this is, at least it's played as a tech card. Final card of the mini set is Busy Peon, which I've been all weekend. It's a 2-mana 2/3 minion. Death Rattle, your next location costs 2 less. Classically, any effect where it says your next something costs X less has been good in Hearthstone. We have Aqua Archivist, which discounts your next elemental. Stormpike Battle Ram, which has a Death Rattle. Your next beast costs 2 less. Fierce Outsider, Outcast minion costs 1 less, or Outcast card, sorry. Planted Evidence, a spell costs 2 less. Snowflurry, your hero power costs 2 less, aka 0. And even Deckhand saw some play back in the day with Weapon Warrior. That makes your next weapon cost 1 less. So, you know, buttons, spells, minions, anything you can discount it is always a good thing. And typically sees some sort of testing and some playing tier 1, you know, decks out there. Amplified Snow Fury saw some play in the tier 1 deck, so did Planted Evidence. These are good cards. Do I think Busy Peon, the location discounter, is going to be good? No, I think it's going to be pretty bad. Part of the reason why, and again, you could probably allude to this if you look at the text on the cards, is that it is not a quick discount. And that's really what you want on the discount card. You want the effect to come up early, because otherwise your opponent can, like, they could subvert this card in some way. For example, not killing it is one of them. They could transform it, they could silence it, they could bounce it, that type of thing. So you really want your effect for the discount to come up fast, and that's what you get with Planted Evidence. It's what you get with the Amplified Snow Fury. You get it with the Deckhand, the Archivist, the Fierce Outsider. You get the discount on the next card you play immediately. The only actual exemption of this on the Battlecry side of things is really the Stormpike Battle Ram, which had a Death Rattle, but it had Rush, so you could actually, you know, make the effect faster to kill it early. Busy Peon doesn't have that. Unless you kill it yourself, it's just going to sit on the board on turn 2 as a turn 3, and your opponent is probably not going to kill it. The other issues of this card is actually when you look at the locations you could discount with this. Horizon's Edge would be a really nice card to discount with this. It's a strong location, and it lets you fight back for the board as well pretty nicely. It is a bit awkward though on the mana curve, no? You play your Busy Peon, your opponent kills it for whatever reason, or you trade it on turn 3, I suppose. Your Horizon's Edge becomes a 2-mana card on turn 3. That's a little bit annoying, no? It's just slightly annoying. I'm wasting 1 mana. So, okay, maybe I'm being stupid. Why don't you just hit a 5-mana location then, right? You get a 2-mana discount on a 5-mana location. You can play it on turn 3. That fills the curve very nicely. Oh, there's actually no 5-cost location. Also, actually, there's no 6-cost location either in Hearthstone right now. After the 4 drops, it's actually a 7 drop, which is Prison of Yogg-Saron, and I don't know if you really want to be messing with Yogg. I've messed with Yogg in the past, I've been a believer of Yogg, but Yogg has left me wanting recently. I really think it's actually a big deal that it's just not a location that comfortably fills the curve with your Busy Peon. And then at the end of the day, a lot of the other locations are 1-drops. Some of them are pretty weak effects, not like great turnaround cards. I'd probably say Horizon's Edge is one of the better case cards for this. The other card that maybe you see some testing with is actually the Crystal Cove from Rogue. Maybe you run like a really hyper-aggressive deck, your Busy Peon dies on 2, Crystal Cove becomes a 1-mana location, you play the location and you play a 2-drop for 5/5 stat line with the Crystal Cove. That would actually be a pretty nice play overall. It does mean you have to go pretty aggressive, it does mean you need your Peon to die, and if this ever was a strong deck, you would just create a situation where your opponent couldn't kill the Peon into your board, you just wouldn't play a minion, or you wouldn't play a minion strong enough to do 3 damage, so I think this card just is going to be pack filler, basically. What a great way to finish off. That is all the cards in the mini set. Let me know of any decks you think are going to be particularly strong, or any archetypes you think are going to get pushed by the mini set. Personally, I think the big one is going to be Big Spell Mage. I think it's going to get a huge push. Anyway, I think this is coming out on Tuesday, so as I upload this to YouTube, it's going to be in 2 days' time. I will be streaming some decks. I'll put together some stuff with the new cards, and we'll see what we can do. Anyway, thanks for watching the reveals, and I'll see you again next time. Bye!